Our next guest is Fredrik Heiding, a research fellow at Harvard, who has deployed a framework for evaluating national cybersecurity strategies. Thank you so much for joining us again, Fred. Our next guest is Fredrik Heiding, a research fellow at Harvard, who has deployed a framework for evaluating national cybersecurity strategies. Thank you so much for joining us again, Fredrik.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
So let's get right into it. There has been a lot of talk at Black Hat this year about national security around voting, around infrastructure. So tell me why you decided to look at this aspect of cybersecurity and national security.
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you remember from last year, I have had a technical focus for most part of my life, but I did realize that even if we have these really good technical solutions, they need to be implemented and they need to work in practice. So I started to working a lot with the policy people and analyzing, well, how do we get this technical change through? How do we get it to really have an impact? And then of course we came across the national cybersecurity strategies, which are these documents that evaluate voting and government security, but also everything else, such as telecom security, energy power plant security, how to protect people, just the holistic security of countries. And we really wanted to analyze in my team, how do they work? And these documents are really good, but they're political documents, which is kind of tricky because it's a technical subject. And how does that play out? And we just analyzed a bunch of different strategies across the board and saw, what did US do well? What did Australia do well? What can we learn from each other? And the good thing about this is there's a lot of countries that don't have this strategy yet, such as smaller countries, and we wanted to help them. So when, for example, Sweden, when I'm born, or some other place, when they're creating new national cybersecurity strategies, they don't have to start from scratch. We wanted to give them some sort of framework so they can learn from the good things and mistakes from other countries with bigger states who already created this.
That makes perfect sense. So tell me, what are the strategies that you analyzed specifically?
Yeah, so in this first iteration we analyzed 9 countries, and I'm not going to list all of them, but the big ones are US, Australia, UK, and also some that are a bit different, like Singapore, because we want to have a spread on it, and Japan and South Korea. And we started with only countries that have some sort of a good cyber reputation. So they have a pretty good practice. They are primarily relatively democratic, and they are somewhat of a similar political system. And in future iteration, we will do a more totalitarian stage, such as China and North Korea and Russia, and see how they differ. And in an even future iteration, we'll do third world countries and small budget states and see how and if they work with cybersecurity.
So in this first iteration, how much difference is there in a cybersecurity strategy from a Singapore and Australia to the US?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first thing we sort of have to know is that these are political documents, and they really are, which means that they differ based on the political context, right? So between the US and Singapore, there are quite a lot of differences because Singapore, they have more of a centralized authority. They can do a little bit more surveillance. They have more power to do these kind of things, which allows them to have a bit more stringent cybersecurity. They're also smaller, so it's a little bit easier to secure them, but they have a really tight and good cybersecurity for the entire population. Whereas in the US, we have really good security in many parts, but in some areas, such as protecting vulnerable population, we fall short because that's just haven't been a prioritization yet.
Is it sort of the democratic, open nature of the society because of the civil rights and surveillance and our general posture toward government surveillance? I mean, it sounds like you might even be arguing that with all things being equal, more surveillance would be more cybersecurity, and something that from a practical standpoint would make sense, but perhaps not political.
It's a really good question, right? I think given that you do trust the government fully, then of course surveillance is good, right? Because then the government can protect you from the bad guys and so forth. That's of course not always the case, and there's a lot of privacy issues, so there's a lot of aspects to it, and that's why this is interesting, because it's multifaceted. Yes, you want to be secure, but you also want to have your privacy. And how do you work with that in a large state? Because it's also different if you take the US versus the Netherlands.
Right.
The US is a big country, so protecting all parts of it is difficult.
So what is your assessment? I mean, is there one of those countries that is doing much better or much worse than the others? Are there any outliers?
So our big takeaway here is that there are highlights in individual contexts. We'd rather say that than saying this country is way better than all the others. And I think that's the cool thing, right? And we really encourage people to look at our white paper, which we're going to publish in about a month. There we have all these highlights where you can see that the US really works well with shifting the liability from the users to the companies, so that the companies are liable for writing secure code and so forth. Japan is doing a pretty good job of protecting the vulnerable people. And so every country have their own highlights, and this is context dependent. For example, South Korea work a lot against protecting from North Korea. That makes sense because North Korea is the biggest adversary of South Korea. So our main takeaway is that you should learn the general trends of a cyber document, a cyber strategy document, but then you should adapt it to your context, the one that's most important for your country.
That's interesting that it's almost like the pressure of conflict making you up your cybersecurity game, which of course we're seeing in the Ukraine-Russian.
Yeah.
And so conflict, I guess, breeds better cybersecurity.
To some little sense that might be true. That's actually a great question because we're going to do follow-up studies of this, right? And in the coming years, as you said now, the Eastern European states, one can imagine that their documents will probably be a little bit different in the years to come because they're going to take more heed for example, Russian cyber attacks and so forth. So that's a great point. You can also learn sort of the cyber conflict nature, how it evolves, by analyzing these strategy documents, usually, because they are quite timely in that sense.
How difficult was it for a technocrat like yourself to kind of go into the, because policy is almost intentionally written in vagaries and litigatable language.
Yeah.
So, how did you make that translation?
So fortunately, I have a fantastic team, which you definitely link to them somehow in the report. There's 4 people in the project. So there's me, Alex O'Neill, Lachlan Price, and Eric Rosenbach. And my 3 collaborators are highly political. So I'm the only computer science focused person. And that's very helpful. But fortunately, these cyber strategy documents, they're actually very easy to read. They're easy to digest, which is good. And we have one leg of our framework evaluates how is the language, how clearly is this policy communicated. And it's usually communicated very clearly, which is good. However, a downside I want to add is that they are clear, but they're really bad at being specific, about having concrete and measurable outlines, which, from a technical person, is a bit of the stereotype for political documents.
I would imagine.
Yeah.
So let's talk more about your framework. I'm interested in that.
Yeah.
So what are the legs of your framework that we're going to look at?
Yeah, so there's 5 different legs, and each leg has some subcategories. And these subcategories in turns have different questions that are yes and no answers. So in total, there are 268 criteria questions, so a lot of them. And these questions are things that evaluate everything from critical infrastructure protection to how are vulnerable people protected, how is capacity generated, all these things. And the big categories are who is responsible for what, basically. We codify responsibilities.
Which is such a common conversation in cybersecurity, right?
It really is, because there's a lot of different agencies, and these things are cross-disciplinary, right? So it's not always easy to see who is responsible for what. Then the next big leg is just how are the people protected, the institution, the systems, how is the protectioning happen? And that's the fundamental cornerstone, right? The protection. And we evaluate a bunch of stuff in that. Then we evaluate leg 3, which is generating capacity. All the countries work really hard on this, which is great. So it's apparent that everyone knows there's a big shortage of skilled cyber labor, and they address this. So that's great. The 4th leg is partnership. You can't do this in isolation. And the partnerships is really tricky. Almost every document are really good at partnerships and really bad, because there's a lot of different partnerships.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good line, right? So some countries are really good at intra-governmental partnerships. Germany is quite good at that, for example.
Private,
yeah, exactly, and just how the different agencies work together. And some countries are really good at regional partnerships. Some countries work a lot with international partnerships. There's so many different types of partnerships. You need to collaborate with industry, with government, with research agencies. So we see that it's very hard to sort of check all the boxes. That might be okay, but partnerships are really tricky because we think that you need to have a strong partnership base in honestly all of the systems to be effective. But that's hard because it's easy to miss some of them.
That's interesting. So I would imagine in countries that you plan to look at where the government is everything and controls everything, I guess maybe by definition that would be a weakness.
Yeah, I think the partnerships, at least different, right? It might be a case that the intra-agency partnerships are good because inside the government there are a lot of clear structures.
Yeah.
But the regional partnerships might be lacking, right? And then you have to see, it's not necessarily lagging because that might be an intentional strategy, right? They say this is the way we do it and we don't care about anyone else. Maybe that's how we do it, and that's one way to do it. I think it's hard to justify that that's a good thing to do, but it might be possible.
Fredrik, thank you so much. I could talk about this subject with you for a much longer time, but
Me too.
unfortunately, we have run out of our time. Can you tell our audience where they can find out more about your work?
Yeah, so I think the best way is to either subscribe to the DETS link on the Harvard Belfer Center, and that is a Defense Emerging Technology and Strategy Center. I can send a link to that, or just shoot me an email and then I'll help you out. But if you subscribe to the Harvard Belfer Center's DETS newsletter, then you're going to get an email when we publish the report in September, and then you're going to be able to read all of this.
Wonderful. Thank you
Cool.
so much for being back with us again this year.
Thank you.
Fredrik Heiding, Harvard Research Fellow.